Welcome back to Citizen Earned. This is the third video in the Second Amendment playlist, following episode 4 in the foundational playlist. So again, those contentious words. The Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Boy, what am I supposed to do with that? Remember, I took an oath to protect the country from all enemies, both foreign and domestic, and that led me on this entire mission or pursuit to try to understand how I can be the best citizen I can be, which led to, it's all in the foundational playlist, but essentially the citizen's task, what I do every day to be the best citizen that I can be. And how on earth does the Second Amendment apply to that? In this video, I'm going to cover the use case of the Second Amendment. Is it relevant still, and can it be properly used? Which essentially just boils down to preparedness against oppression and tyranny. In our country's short history, our leaders have encouraged our citizens to make ready and stay ready for any and all situations that might befall the U.S. George Washington said, "A free people ought not only to be armed but disciplined, to which end a uniform and well-digested plan is requisite. And their safety and interest require that they should promote such manufactories," what a word, "as tend to render them independent on others for essential, particularly for military supplies." That was in George Washington's presidential annual address of 1790. I know there's a meme going around that's kind of changed it, and although that meme is not technically accurate, it kind of gets to the essence of what George Washington is trying to say. Link down below. Teddy Roosevelt said, "The great body of our citizens shoot less as time goes on. We should encourage rifle practice among schoolboys and indeed among all classes, as well as in the military services by every means in our power. Thus, and not otherwise, may we be able to assist in preserving peace in the world. The first step in the direction of preparation to avert war, if possible, and to be fit for war if it should come. It is to teach men to shoot." Well, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, and not otherwise, I would also encourage women, girls, or anybody, regardless of classification, to exercise their Second Amendment right and learn to shoot properly. Only teaching guys to shoot is so yesterday. I just don't think that's appropriate anymore, do you? Just kidding. Hope I didn't offend anybody. Link down below. So Teddy suggested that we should be better prepared for possible war and created the civilian marksmanship program, along with many other things, through the 1903 War Department Appropriations Act. Link down below. And surprisingly, the NRA was modeled after the United Kingdom's, the British NRA, which was another response in the 1800s to increase firearms proficiency in civilians. The NRA of that time was focused on education and training for civilians to quickly be turned into soldiers, setting basic standards for safety and proficiency. They facilitated increased proficiency through competition. And this is the first time where we start seeing competitive shooting become a thing, created by the NRA to foster better shooters. And then with these programs and all of these initiatives, the NRA found itself with a lot of members, so it started to fight for and enable all citizens to have access to the Second Amendment. Remember, this was the late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. The Civil War was still fairly fresh in people's minds. The idea of blacks owning firearms, newly freed slaves being able to own firearms, was terrifying to some people. And the NRA stood in opposition to the KKK, most specifically to enable black people to have access to firearms. At at that time, the NRA also effectively stood in opposition to the Democratic Party because remember, the South were the Democrats that were for states' rights to own slaves. These were the people that were afraid of black people getting guns. Man, that was a surprise. When I learned that, that was a surprise. But if you don't believe me, check the link, check the other link. So the takeaway here, again, the Second Amendment was written to enumerate the most basic of survival actions, right? Previous episode, we had the two reasons for the Second Amendment, that of self-defense against any form of oppression, and our best leaders encourage citizens to be prepared and proficient for the national defense thing. I realize there's nothing up on the board. If you're wondering what's supposed to be up on the board, go check out the previous episode. So in order for me to fulfill my oath of allegiance, I have to be willing to protect the concept of individual freedom in this country which stands for the same ideal, with arms that are equal to the government so that they do not have a monopoly on power. And I have to have enough supplies, including ammo, to be able to oppose them if necessary. It's a lot. It's getting to be a lot. But I'm not going to quit, so I kept pushing to discover what that basic standard is. In order for me to share what that basic standard is, first I have to cover some basic terms. So bear with me here. Basic definitions that we have to discuss before this idea can go any further is force versus violence. Force, from the dictionary, means coercion or compulsion, especially with the use or threat of violence. The physics definition of force is F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. And the legal definition of force is power, violence, or pressure directed against a person or thing. So out of those three definitions, I think the legal one works the best here. Force means power, violence, or pressure directed against a person or thing. The important part here is the word directed. Now, let's look at the term violence. The dictionary defines violence as the behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something. The legal definition of violence is the unlawful exercise of physical force or intimidation by the exhibition of such force. There's no scientific or physics definition for violence, so I didn't include it. On this one, I think the legal definition, again, is very telling. The unlawful exercise of physical force or intimidation by the exhibition of such force. The key takeaway here is the word unlawful. So, force is directed in order to direct something and must be controlled. Violence is unlawful and probably not necessarily controlled. So the big difference between force and violence is the fact that force is violence that is controlled. It has limits. It has steps of escalation. It can be a little bit of force or a lot of bit of force. But violence is just oppression. In episode 16, Why the Second, there are some organisms in the natural world, some of them being people, that think it's okay to use violence to get what they want. And the only way to stop violence is to use measured force in the appropriate amounts. Now, what also should be said here is that force can turn into violence depending on the roles. If an antelope is attacked by a lion, the lion is being violent to the antelope. If the antelope defends itself, it's using force to push against the lion, to keep the lion from attacking it. Now, if the lion turns tail and starts running, and the antelope then pursues it, maybe with like a catapult or bow and arrow, and then shoots it in the back, now the antelope is exercising violence, right? And all of a sudden the roles have flip-flopped. Now the antelope is the aggressor and the lion is the defender. And that's why situations can change so very quickly, and why having an accurate understanding of the concepts of force and violence are so important. Some other terms that I have to clarify here. Here are those terrible words again. The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Put it on the border. So let's look at the terms. Militia. Because a lot of people argue about that. And then of course, people talk about arms a lot. So in order to look at this, I'm going to work it backwards. Let's look at the word arms first. Arms is a generic word for weapons ranging from one's actual forearms, fists, elbows, and other hard points to any weapons which could be used by these biological extensions of one's body. Anything from a pitchfork to a paladin. Some people say that the Second Amendment was written with muskets in mind. And there's no argument there. That's obvious. Of course they did. But what they forget to add on to that sentence is that during that time, the military that they were fighting also had muskets and cannons and warships. And civilians had muskets, cannons and warships. So they were equal. So whether we're talking about muskets, hunting rifles, or AR-15s, remember, the second is about enumerating the right of any individual to defend themselves against any form of oppression, and to guarantee equality to do so. They have to have access to equivalent weapons. The Second Amendment protects AR-15s more than it does hunting rifles, shotguns, handguns, sporting arms, or any sort of collection of firearms. The reason it does this is because the AR-15 is as close as a civilian can get to an M16 or an M4. Now most of them are semi-automatic, and those are select fire. But we'll get to that later. Let's not get confused right now. The point here is for equality. So, moving on to defining security of a free state. It's a voluntary, collective action whereby individuals are trained, prepared, and ready to assemble into a militia, if needed, to defend against a threat. So essentially, a militia is a group of civilians, citizens, willing to fight for a cause. It's also been required by law since the beginning of this country. Well, not quite the beginning. The earliest Militia Act happened in 1792 and was followed by the Militia Act of 1862. That was followed by the last Militia Act of 1903. All of these Militia Acts were written in response to advances in technology and the cost of that technology. They were there to maintain the equality between the government and the citizens. And as technology made things better, it made it more expensive. And so states had to start taxing to be able to afford this new technology for their state militias. The other part that we need to discuss about the militia is that it can be assembled and disassembled at any time, as long as the citizens are keeping arms and ammunition. If the citizens aren't trained and they don't practice and they don't have firearms and they don't have ammunition, then organizing into a group just makes them a group of people. But with training and practice and proficiency and firearms and ammunition, they can then be a militia. And that means that the citizens must have arms and ammunition at home at all times. to be prepared. Remember what Teddy Roosevelt said. Essentially, this discussion has been happening for a very long time, and it's kind of the predatory clause and operative clause debate. Links down below. That's some pretty nerdy stuff. Have at it if you'd like. So, that covers arms and militia. So that brings us up to having reviewed force, violence, armed, and militia. So in order for me to figure out what the use case of the Second Amendment is for me, what the basic standards are of how prepared I need to be able to assemble into a militia if I have to, I wanted to see, has the Second Amendment been invoked before? Has there been a need for it before? Has there been a use case for it before? So I looked for examples of tyranny in this country's past. Has this happened before? Now, of course, before the founding of this country or the Declaration of Independence was even written, there were the intolerable acts linked down below. If you don't know what those are, worth a review. But anyway, it kind of sort of led to a revolution, and then out popped the United States later. Another example of tyranny are state racist laws. I kind of touched on this before with the story of the NRA and how certain organizations try to keep firearms out of the hands of black people, of freed slaves, before, during, and after the Civil War. But whether it's inequality directed at an individual or a group based off of action or skin color or any other sort of attribute, it's kind of the government, or that group of people, saying you can't have that. And that's kind of tyranny. It's tyranny whether it's against an individual or a group of people, small group or a large group. And as an example of indirect racism with gun control, the Louisiana literacy test that they used to administer to black people in order for them to be able to vote was the same test that they used to disqualify people, black people, from owning firearms. More of these racist laws can be found in the book Negroes and the Gun by Nicholas Johnson, linked down below. And looking at the history of black people and firearms in this country shows a lot, lends a lot to inform on the idea of what is a militia. For instance, black neighborhoods that were either overtly attacked by law enforcement and by citizens alike formed neighborhood watches, let's call them mini militias, to defend themselves. They would know an attack was coming, they would organize, and they would shoot back, and less people would be injured or killed. Other examples of tyranny include the Robert Charles shooting of 1900. All of the Jim Crow laws banning minorities from firearms, not just blacks. The Bonus Army of 1932. The Move shooting of 1985. Ruby Ridge of 1992. Waco, Texas, 1993. And then Bundy Ranch in 2014. All those links are down below. Now, Bundy Ranch was slightly different because a militia did form. And simply by being there, being present, being armed, being well organized, the government backed off. Just like with Ruby Ridge and Waco. They had sniper rifles and various other weapons pointed at women and children, not necessarily the people breaking the law. Now, I'm not going to get political and say whether Bundy Ranch was right or wrong, whether the government was in the right or in the wrong. But what I will say, it is a successful case of where simply having a militia was enough of a deterrent to stop violence from happening and brought both sides back to the table to talk. And I think that's kind of what we all want. And then, of course, I have to mention all of the domestic troubles that led to culmination in 2020. Philando Castile and so many more. Down below is a list of them all. Each one should be dignified, studied, and we should learn something from them so that we can get better with this whole thing. That's a somber note. It's a difficult situation. I have faith in us, though, and I know that we can get through it. Now, those are examples of tyranny. Previously, when I used to share this information with people and talk with them, at this point in the argument, they would say, yeah, but an AR-15 can't fight back against the government. The government has tanks, bombers, and nukes. And how's your little AR-15 going to stand up against that? I encourage those people to look at the war in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so on. War has changed. Guerrilla tactics, asymmetrical war. Those folks with those ideologies have been giving the US a hard time for almost 20 years. Small arms can be very effective against very powerful people. And those guerrillas fighting that asymmetrical war, they don't even have posse comitatus, which we have here in the States. If you don't know what that is, link down below. Concerning our domestic troubles, the difference between a protester and a rioter is about the same as a difference between enforcing laws and violating posse comitatus. It's a very fine line. It's a difficult place to be in. And we all kind of need to know all of this stuff so that we can help each other create a brighter tomorrow. That's essentially to say, one is lawful and the other is not. One is protected as a right, and the other is unbridled violence against innocent people. If a president broke posse comitatus, it would be an overt act of war by the US government against the US citizens. Okay, now we're getting pretty tense. This is getting into a very difficult and awkward and uncomfortable situation, but bear with me. If, for whatever reason, that were to happen, let's run some numbers. Okay, we have 1.3 million armed forces in this country. We have about 800,000 law enforcement officers. Together, that's about 2 million people. Just for good measure, or if the statistics are different, let's multiply that by 2. That equals 4 million law enforcers, okay? In a country of 330-ish million, 100 million of them, a third of them, are gun owners. They have 600 million small arms. 100 million divided by 4 million equals 25. That means 1 law enforcer to 25 armed civilians. I don't say this to scare anyone. These are just the numbers. Feel free, if you are of a victim mindset, to go ask a law enforcement officer if they think they're worth 25 armed civilians. I don't think that you'll find a single law enforcement officer that's willing to say that. Those odds are really long. And let's not forget, most military and law enforcement are on the side of the Second Amendment. So if a president broke posse comitatus and said, go kill X population in the United States, or infringe on their Bill of Rights, or whatever, the people that would do that enforcement, these law enforcers, are the people that are going to say, you're being violent, you're being unreasonable, you're being irrational, that's not using force. We don't support that. So the more people push to remove these 600 million small arms, the more they're creating a divide, the more they're pushing for friction, the more difficult they're making the situation. This is also where a lot of our domestic troubles stem from. See, all enemies of the United States know all of this. They see this. So, they know there's no way with an invading force or many other strategies that they can harm the United States. Because we're so secure because of this, they know the only option they have is to make us fight ourselves. We're armed, right? And if they can push this number to fight this number, not only will there be chaos, disorganization, lots of death, all kinds of political plays, we will have weakened ourselves to the point of where they can get the upper hand. So the Second Amendment is kind of one of the linchpins that can either make this country very strong or can break it apart, depending on how the citizens use it. The enemies of the United States support as much divisiveness as we're willing to fuel. The antidote to that is not more gun control. It might be more education. Training would go a long way. But at the end of the day, each individual American, remember the Constitution starts with we the people. Me, that person, you, we the people. Each individual person has to look inward and see, what do we have in here? Do we have love for one another, or do we have hate? And if we have hate, why? The fastest, easiest way to fight hate is to step outside one's own comfort zone and go see what someone else's life is like. Go experience their life. I realize it's a little harder. I know there are some restrictions, but that should be all of our goal. Now that took a slightly crazy turn, because I'm still trying to find an answer to what are the basic standards of being a militia member and being prepared. So being able to do what George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt has asked of the nation. To be proficient and to have enough stuff. In saying that, I feel like Scourge. Behold my stuff! But anyway, so to recap this real quick, the Second Amendment is a right. It's a responsibility. It is historically founded. It has been needed before. There is a genuine use case for it. I just painted a picture of what it could be in the future. And so getting back to the whole point, which are what are the requirements, the standards that are put on me as a citizen to honor my oath of allegiance. What does it mean to be a militiaman? We've covered the basic definitions. Unfortunately, this answer isn't published in a book anywhere. I haven't been able to find it anywhere. We the people, kind of have to figure it out. From all of the opinions that are out there, I have to figure out which ones to trust. Now, I realize that the further I go down here, the more questions there are. But this has been my journey. I've dedicated years of my life to trying to figure this out. Come along with me. Next episode is Who to Trust, episode 18. See you there. Bonus question for watching until the end. This tie, does it conform to flag code? Put the answers down in the comment section.